organizer, strategist, and activist. And I am working together with the lovely folks here at Nuclear Ban Treaty Collaborative to help organize some media trainings and to get some media attention around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So today we will be talking a little bit about letters to the editor. This is the second part of a media training, the last, which happened, I believe was last week, maybe a week and a half ago. So if you're interested in checking that out, I will be referring to the other training a little bit, and it is available on YouTube, and I'm sure the organizers will provide you with a link to that video so you can check that out. But before we get started, and I've introduced myself a little bit, but would love to get to know all of you in the room a little better. I want to go through a little bit of some housekeeping. So first, we are all on Zoom. I'm sure at this point in the pandemic, you've encountered it at least once, but in case you haven't, I just want to do some quick how-tos so that this meeting can go well for everyone and we can all learn together. So the first, as I'm sharing, this is probably what your Zoom screen looks like, but with many more faces, or because I'm sharing my screen, you're really just seeing my face right now. So the first thing I want to do is just note the mute button over in your left bottom corner. If you can go ahead and click that, we'd like to only have one person speaking at a time tonight. And when you ask your questions, I'm going to show you how to in just a minute, but we're going to be asking folks to utilize the chat that is now circled here. And when you click on that chat button, I'm going to ask you to do your introductions that way. We're going to be collecting questions throughout the presentation this way. When you click that, a little chat bubble will pop up, or because I'm sharing my screen, it might not be on the left-hand side of your screen, it might pop up in the middle. And then we'll look like that. You can type your questions there. And then if you want to close the chat, this little caret, you click that and you can close your chat. The one thing I ask of you throughout, if you want to minimize your Zoom screen, so you want to stay on this webinar, but you want to maybe, I don't know, pull up an example letter to the editor or write your own while we're going. Just make sure that you minimize and you don't X out, otherwise you'll have to rejoin the webinar. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a minute and would love to get to know all of you a little bit. So I'd love for folks in the chat some folks are having issues with audio. Can everyone hear?
I think it's sorted now.
Great, wonderful. Sorry, I was sharing my screen and I actually couldn't see the chat in real time, but wonderful. I'm glad everyone can hear. So yeah, would love everyone to put in the chat your name, your pronouns, where you're joining us from, if you're affiliated with an organization. And I know I did last time, but I know we have a different group of folks this time. So why do you care? Or what makes you excited about a world without nuclear weapons? So if you want to go ahead and share that in the chat now, it's just really great to get to know everyone in the room. And also it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. I'm really excited to have you all here with us. Awesome. Hello, lots of vets for peace I'm seeing. Welcome. Wolf, I'm seeing a few Wolf folks. Welcome, welcome. Curiosity, we're always here to learn. Love folks that are here to learn and to dig in and to help the movement. California, Houston, I love to see it. Well, as folks continue to introduce themselves, I want to go over just a few housekeeping notes. So I'm going to share my screen again, and then we can dig in. So tonight we've kind of gone through a welcome. I'm now going to go through a housekeeping. We then want to, I'm going to be passing the mic a bunch tonight. We're going to go into a little bit of background with the campaign, some of the goals and aims. We're then going to go into what makes a good letter to the editor, how to submit those. We're going to do a real life example and walk you through what a letter to the editor that deals with the first meeting of states party and coverage of the ban treaty can look like. And then we will wrap up. And throughout, I'll be pausing for questions. So again, if you have questions, please be sure to throw those in the chat. We've got folks monitoring the chat. I will be pausing, running through those questions and then answering them. And if I don't answer it, it's probably because we're getting to it in another part of the conversation tonight. So fret not, we will get to your questions. So I am going to, again, stop sharing my screen, and I am going to turn it over to Ralph Hutchinson to talk through a little bit more about the campaign and what brings us here tonight.
Thanks, Yasmeen. And that's exactly my topic. How did we get here? Earlier this year, the week before he launched the invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin gave a speech in France. And in that speech, he said two things. First, he said, but we also understand that Russia is one of the world's leading nuclear powers. And a moment later, finishing his veiled threat, he noted that in a nuclear war, and this is his quote, there will be no winners. 1 week later, Putin, backed by his nuclear weapons and the threat to use them, invaded Ukraine. And this was cause for alarm around the world. In the United States, polls showed that more than 70% of respondents were concerned or very concerned about nuclear weapons. There was a flurry of reporting about Putin's nuclear threat across the media spectrum. And each time Putin or one of his ministers mentioned nukes, there was another burst of articles. A prime example of this media attention happened on Sunday, March 27th, when NPR's Weekend Edition devoted 7 minutes, that's an eternity in radio time, to an interview about the nuclear threat. And in those 7 minutes, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was not mentioned once. It's not the treaties weren't mentioned. The all but declared dead non-proliferation treaty dominated the conversation. Unfortunately, this was not an exception. When I did a Google search for Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I found the New York Times last reported on the treaty in October of 2020, when Honduras became the 50th state to ratify, triggering the treaty's entry into force the following January. No report on that historic January day, despite more than 100 actions taking place across the country celebrating the entry into force. Now, Emma found a more recent mention of the treaty in the Times from last summer, but in the last few months, in the face of the Russian threat, nothing. This holds true almost entirely across the board in the mainstream media in the United States. In early May, CNN broke the silence ever so briefly with an op-ed piece by Ira Helfand, co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Ira wrote about the nuclear threat and included near the very end of his op-ed this sentence: the 9 nuclear nations must no longer hold their own people and all humanity hostage. If we are to survive, they must come together and negotiate a verifiable, enforceable timetable to eliminate nuclear arsenals so they can all join the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That was it. Now, I noticed there were links in the Helfand piece that caught my eye. There was an article titled "A New Generation is Being Introduced to the Nuclear Threat." And in that article, the writer did not mention the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and offered this encouraging assessment. I quote, "There's no single individual effort any one of us can make, except for the president, to keep ourselves safe." Another linked article from a trio of experts is entitled "The Only Way to Guarantee Nuclear Weapons Are Never Used." And on the plus side, that article in March of this year said that eliminating nuclear weapons is the only way to be sure they aren't used. But on the not so plus side, they didn't mention the ban treaty. So this week, we aim to prove the CNN writer who said individuals are helpless in the face of the current nuclear threat wrong. Her thesis is the result of really a self-fulfilling prophecy. tell people there's nothing they can do, withhold information about the one thing that can make a difference, and you end up with people who think there's nothing they can do, and they're trapped in their anxiety. They just want it to go away, and thanks to psychic numbing, it does eventually recede back into the unthinkable. But here are some things people can do. Last week, hundreds of thousands of people were represented by the 140 plus organizations that sent a message to President Joe Biden with a full page ad in the Delaware News Journal. We haven't heard back yet. This week, we're sending a message to the media. It's a very simple message. We want them to cover the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We want a concerted, consistent, simple, clear message delivered by hundreds of people, every one of you, to the mainstream media outlets in the United States. We have chosen the New York Times, NPR, and CNN. If we get even one of them to start covering the TPNW, we'll not only break the silence, we'll get them all, because that's the way the big feet media work. To do this, we're asking you to send letters this week. Yasmeen is going to give us some instruction, and we are going to provide resources, but the success of this effort depends entirely on you to really write and submit a letter. Yasmeen is going to tell you the rules for letters to the editor, and they're good ones. And then we're going to suggest that just this once, you break some of them, because this is not an effort to get your letter printed in the New York Times. This is more of a guerrilla action to call the media to account for its failure to include the TPNW in its coverage. The media might feel they're not totally to blame. After all, their silence just mirrors the government's silence. But that's a problem, because we count on the media to hold the government accountable. It's easy for them to report on what the government does, for better or worse. It's harder for them to report on what the government doesn't do. But that's what we need, because the TPNW exists. It's real. It represents the demands of the non-nuclear armed nations of the world. It's a direct challenge to the United States and 8 other countries. And any media that claims to tell us all the news that's fit to print, or any media that considers all things, has a responsibility to report this crucially important story, especially at a moment when the existential threat of nuclear weapons is suddenly, this could happen today or tonight, and in the minds of people across the country. Finally, the other timeliness of this effort is the upcoming historic, Sophia rightly calls it groundbreaking, first meeting of states parties in Vienna next week. The United States won't be there because our shame outweighs our promise to disarm, made more than 50 years ago. But the US media should be there, listening to the voices of people who have been affected by our bombs, reporting on our absence, telling us all the news. It's a specific ask, something they can do right now. So that's the other piece of our message. Cover the first meeting of states parties in Vienna. You can send either message, cover the TPNW or cover the first meeting, or both. Our goal is to flood these media outlets. For this effort to succeed, we not only need you to write, and if you'll send your letter to all 3 media outlets, that would be great, but we also need your help recruiting others to write. After this Zoom, we will post step-by-step instructions on the website. Emma will show you in a moment that you can use and share with friends. Some of us on this Zoom belong to organizations that have hundreds or thousands of members, and you can reach out to your list to ask people to write. So what we need to do this week is possible. We just have to wake up to our own power. Take a minute to stretch if you need to, and then write. This is the week. The next 3 days are crucial if we're going to get the media to Vienna to cover the treaty that can save us all. That's my plea. Write, and write now.
Thank you, Ralph. And I'm feeling energized and really excited to share all of the tips that I have with you. As Ralph mentioned, some of the things that I might say tonight might go a little counter to the strategy, and we'll get into that. I think the thing to keep in mind as I'm going through is this is in an ideal scenario. If your topic's kind of already being covered, you've got articles to refer back to. This will help you get published in that way. So with that, I'm going to once again share my screen with you all. And we're gonna cover how to write LTEs that will ideally get published and help further the movement. So I just wanna, I know we have some new faces, and for those of you who were on our last webinar, thank you. This might sound familiar, but it is really important. So why does media matter? Media matters for a variety of reasons, and there's lots of different ways to get media, and the LTE is one of the most accessible, not only for the everyday person, but really for a mass movement. When we submit multiple LTEs, that really gets the media's attention, that really gets them to listen, especially when we all are delivering a similar message. So it raises the visibility of our issue. Media has the ability to influence decision makers. It has the ability to educate the public. And really all of those things work towards building our power as a movement. So I again cover this in the last thing, but I think it's really important to couch the fact like, why are we doing this? Because it can move the needle. So with that in mind, I want to go over some best practices for submitting a letter to the editor before I get into the nitty-gritty of what does a good letter to the editor look like. And so the first piece of advice that again might go a little counter to what you'll hear tonight is what is the recent article that you're responding to. Oftentimes a great hook or a great way to make sure that your letter to the editor gets published is to be responding to an article kind of in real time. So if you're reading an article that mentions nuclear weapons, get on that as soon as possible, and get the same logic holds, get as many people to submit their own as they can. This works both on national outlets, but also is especially useful for your local outlets. Getting 5 to 15 people to write letters to the editor on the same topic, again, with the same, and we'll go into this, the same kind of solutions, is a really great way to get your message out there and educate the public and decision makers. If there is no article for you to be responding to, and again, this is outside of the realm of the larger campaign we're talking about, maybe you should think about writing an opinion piece, an op-ed, or pitching the media on a story that a reporter can themselves cover. And this, again, was covered in the last training that we did. Something really important about letters to the editor, they're short, sweet, and they're to the point. Most of them have a pretty limited word count. I've seen some word counts on letters to the editor as short as 150 words. I've seen them as long as 300 words. They kind of span that word count. So you, again, they're short, sweet, and to the point, and you want to know for whatever outlet you are submitting to what that word count is. Letters to the editor, they can be real sticklers for making sure that you fall within procedures. Another procedure that you'll often find, and actually one of them, I know that one of the outlets you all will be submitting to is the New York Times. And they actually, on their rules of writing letters to the editor, one thing, and a lot of papers ask for this, is that you only submit that letter to the editor to that singular paper. I know that in our minds, it's a numbers game, and we want to submit, like we've written it once, we want to submit as many as of that version as possible to as many papers as we can. However, if you think about it from the paper side of things, if they are running your letter to the editor and then the same day or the next day, another paper runs that exact same thing, it's not seen as original, it's not seen as a genuine response to their article. And it could lead to you getting less coverage in the future, bad relations. Again, there are moments that you will step outside of this. This could be one of those, but I just want to put that out there that it is just an important thing to keep in mind and is present on a lot of papers. And most outlets they do vary, outlet to outlet, like I said, 150 words, 300 words, 200 words. Most outlets state their policies on their website, or if it's a physical magazine or paper, on the opinion page itself, it might say at the bottom, like, do you have a response? Write us here. And they'll have the guidelines there. So oftentimes it is really important to follow these procedures exactly if you want to be published, but they do vary paper by paper. So some tips to keep in mind as you are kind of thinking of responding to an article for a letter to the editor. Again, because they're so short, I know I say 200 words, 150 words, but that really is 2 lean paragraphs or 1 meaty paragraph. So you've got a short amount of space to really make your argument and make your case. So it's best to stick to a clear point throughout your letter. The other thing that helps get a letter published is to avoid exaggeration. So you can definitely convey how angry and frustrated you are, or how something doesn't make sense, but I would avoid overstatement and hyperbole, because then your letter is less likely to be published. And then the final thing about letters to the editor is these make it personal, right? When you are responding to an article, the reason that it is published as an opinion piece, as a letter to the editor, is it's because it's the town square. It's a conversation that's happening. So as personal as you can make it, not only is it more likely to be published, but it's also more compelling to your audience, whether that is that legislator or that general public that you want to educate. It helps make a connection between you and the issue. So now I want to talk a little bit. I've talked about kind of some things to keep in mind. I would like to go into what a simple outline could look like for a letter to the editor. Again, bearing in mind that each of these things I'm referring to might be 1 to 2 sentences because of how short we are talking about. So the first is refer to the original author or article. So it could be something like on May 9th, author A wrote a fascinating article about the state of our land. I'm going to use an example of an old LTE I wrote, so it's about landfills in Oregon. But so author A wrote about the impacts of our landfills, but I think they were missing X point. Or the author might have done a really good job, but didn't put forward the exact solution that you and your campaign are looking for. So you could say, I thought author A's article on May 9th was really fantastic, but missed a key point. I would like to point out, and then that's the 1 point of your letter to the editor, is that solution. So you can use letter to the editors both ways, to call out things. Oftentimes it's always to call out things you think are missing, but whether you think that the author hasn't gone far enough, didn't draw the right conclusion, you can kind of take that in any direction. It can be friendly or foey, depending on what article you're responding to. So next you're going to want to state the problem. Why are you concerned? And so an example of that, again, using my landfills in Oregon example. So that sentence could read something like, landfills are filling up and hazardous chemicals are leaching into the groundwater. Again, it's very straightforward. It gets right to the heart of the problem. After that, you're going to want to describe a problem in a way that helps people in your community, and whether your community is, again, your local town or the nation, understand why this is a problem. So our garbage crisis is making Oregon a less livable place. So people might say, yeah, garbage is a problem. Yeah, we don't want a lot of it, but what's the impact? It means that we have less health. We have our environment is polluted, et cetera. You want to kind of ground it in reality. Next, you're going to want to lay out the solution. So I like to think about this as the broad terms of the solution. So obviously, like, less garbage would be the thing, but then also, how do we achieve that solution? Like, what will help us narrow in on that broad vision? So in this case, packaging should no longer burden our landfills. So that's kind of the broad thing, like we need less garbage. We should vote for the recycling initiative so that packaging will become more recyclable and reusable. This will bring industry into the recycling efforts that government and the public are already aware of. So again, that broad, we need less garbage, and that narrow, we need to pass this exact initiative in order to achieve a piece of or all of that broader goal. I also think of this as a call to action. Like, this is your moment of, yes, we need to pass this initiative, or you need to turn out to your polling place on election day, or you need to call your senator, or Senator X needs to step up and do Y. And you'll see that in the example that Emma wrote. And then finally, you want to just write a final why, and make it personal and make it punchy, because you're kind of putting a neat little bow on the arguments that you made in your one paragraph up until this point. And that is kind of the bare bones. I'll actually stay on this page. The bare bones outline of why or how you go about writing a letter to the editor, keeping in mind these things of making one point. So as you notice throughout my example of the garbage, the point was garbage is bad. We have too much of it. We need less of it. Here's how. I could probably, if I were writing an op-ed piece on the garbage, I could say, these chemicals impact human health in XYZ ways, and these are all of the ways why. But in an op-ed, even though you could go down those roads, in a letter to the editor, you want to keep it very narrow and focus on the solutions. So with that, I am going to pause here and see if any folks have any questions. And so those folks who are kindly monitoring the chat for me, if anything has popped up, please let me know.
So nothing has come up in the chat yet, but I'm sure that some people have questions. So this is a moment to ask them. And also we'll have another chance later on as well. So if you don't have a question now, but you think of one later, you can put it in the chat and we'll address it.
Wonderful. Cheryl, if you could please pop your question into the chat, that would be wonderful.
Well, I think I've made a comment that is already in the chat about this issue of it being related to an article.
Oh, Cheryl just got muted.
Oh, Cheryl, you are muted. Let me.
I think I
Usually you're referring to an article that's just been in the paper. And in fact, that was the first thing you said we should do in this letter.
Yeah.
So, you know, are we all referring to the same article? Are we talking about North Korea, for example?
So in this case, as Ralph mentioned, we're doing things a little bit differently this time. Mine were, yes, in an ideal world, you would get Wilf together and you would say, we're all responding to this article that just came out today. Emma is actually going to talk a little bit more about this specific strategy. So I think you can take the teachings I just gave you and apply them more broadly, but in this specific, we wanted you to have the building blocks to write a great letter, even though we're bending the rules, as Ralph said, a little bit with this specific action, and we're going to get a little bit more into that. And with that, I am actually going to turn it over to Emma to show you how she bent those rules and for what ends.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Yasmeen. And also just thank you in general for that wonderful training on how to write an effective LTE, because as we've mentioned a couple of times already, I think this is going to be incredibly helpful for all of us anytime, in the future when we write a letter to the editor. If, next week something is published and we think, I want to reply to that, we can do that right away. And at the same time, as has also been already mentioned for this specific campaign, we have a very clear focus right now, this next coming week, these coming days, which is to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons into the awareness of the US mainstream media and urge them to include the treaty in any discussions related to nuclear weapons. And so because of that, our strategy, again, will break a few of the sort of typical LTE rules that Yasmeen has taught us, because our goal is a little bit different. Usually the goal would probably be to get your LTE published. And in our case, the goal is essentially to be so loud that the media can't ignore us. So even if we don't publish a single letter to the editor this time, that's okay, because our goal is to be heard. And so we are here today to do that. And we've also we've tried to make it as simple and easy as possible. So this campaign strategy is to target 3 of the top media outlets in the country, which some people have touched on. Some of them don't actually accept letters to the editor per se, but they are the New York Times, CNN, and NPR. And I'm going to share my screen to show you just the steps that for this campaign we're going to go through. So the first thing to do is to go to the Nuclear Ban Treaty Collaborative website. And I will also put this in the chat. But if you scroll down on the home page, so you don't have to navigate anywhere, just scroll down on the home page and you'll see this button that says write and submit your letters to the media. And when you click on that, everything that you need to write these letters to the media is on this page. So there's an explanation here of what we're doing and why. And then these are the 3 outlets that we are targeting. And there's a how-to sheet for each one because each one has a slightly different process. And then if you scroll down further, there are 2 other resources that are really helpful. One is tips for writing and placing letter to the editor. So that's sort of like a condensed version of what Yasmeen has gone through with us. And then this over here is a document of talking points. So if you sit down and want to write one of these letters, but you feel a little bit lost for words or you don't know where to start, this document is the place to go. You can, when I wrote my letter actually earlier today, I used this document and a lot of the information in it. So I want to just show you each of these documents about the how-tos because they're a little bit, each a little bit different. So I'm going to start with the New York Times because this one, I'm sure many people on this call are much more familiar even than I am. I think you are the experts on this. But the New York Times has a very simple, really straightforward process for submitting your letters to the editor. All you have to do is email it to this address and to make sure that it's in, your letter is in the body of the email, so not as an attachment. But also, as Yasmeen taught us, the New York Times, among others, has quite strict requirements for your letter. So it's good to make sure that it follows all of these. So here are the requirements. And then the good thing to know is also that if your letter is selected for publication, you'll be notified. They said within a week. And if they decide not to publish your letter, you will also receive a notification, an automated email reply. So either way, you will know, you will hear something back. And so if you submit a letter and you get an auto reply that it's not going to be published, well, then you have this letter that you've already written. In our case, typically, it would be in response to a particular article, and yours might be, but it might not be, which means in our case, you can repurpose a lot of the letter, if not all of it, to send to other outlets if it doesn't get published in this case, and if you hear back. So this one is very, very simple, but this page has a lot of other things that you might need to write your letter. So we have compiled some of the most recent articles that you might want to respond to. Again, typically, you see as long ago as April, May, typically you would not write a letter to the editor this late in response to something in April. But again, because our goal is a little bit different this time, these are okay, or you don't have to use these, but you can. And each page also has this hopefully helpful information, which is the last time that outlet covered the TPNW. So that could be a talking point as well. You could just write, the last time, essentially they've covered it once a year in the last 2 years. And so that is the New York Times. Next, if we go to CNN, you can also download these documents onto your computer if you want, but I'm just choosing to open them in my browser. The CNN example is a little bit different because unlike the New York Times, CNN doesn't have a process for submitting a letter that is, a timely response to a specific article or specific coverage. But we still wanted to target them. because of their platform. And that doesn't mean that we can't tell them what we want to see. And so in CNN's case, instead of responding to specific coverage, we can send them feedback about what we would like to see. So the steps for this are also here. But step one, you click on this link. So it'll take you to something that looks like this. And then here we are. And then you just follow the steps. So from the topic drop-down menu, you select editorial feedback. So we're going to give editorial feedback. And then from the feedback menu, you have to select a category, and we suggest selecting general political feedback. So that would be here, general political feedback. And once you've done that, you fill in the rest with your name, your email address, and here's where you put the comment. Because this isn't in response to or not necessarily in response to a particular article or particular coverage, this is where you can just send your message of essentially, why you want to see CNN cover the TPNW. Why do you think that's important? You can go to the talking points for that as well. So that is the CNN case. And those two are very different. And then finally, I'm just going to go over NPR because this one is a kind of a mix of the two. With NPR, we have two options, one that's more of a letter to the editor type option, and one that's more the feedback option. In this case, they call it submit a story idea. So if you hear or read or see something on NPR, just like you did, Ralph, that you said you saw over the weekend, or you heard rather, and you want to respond directly to that right away, like if you see one this week, then you can do option one. And this is the same, you write a letter to the editor, you just submit it in a different way. Option two is, again, kind of like what you would do with CNN version, is if you just to get your message across, just to basically send the message that we want to see whether it's the TPNW covered, or we want to see, the first meeting of states parties is coming up. We want to see this covered. So the instructions for those are both here, but I'm actually going to share the option two instructions because they're a little bit more, complex. Well, actually, they're not complex, but if you say you submitted something to CNN and you already have that, and you think, I want to submit the same thing to NPR as well, this is where you would do that. And do you know what? Actually, I don't think we need to go through it, but just to show you how it looks, you follow these instructions and you'll get taken to this page. And then you need to select something from send my story idea. So at NPR, you can't send it just to NPR in general. You have to send it to one of their programs. So we are recommending that from this menu, you choose to send it to All Things Considered. And then in the same way, you fill out your information, you put your message here. And once you've filled out all your info, it will allow you to send. So those are the three sort of different outlets that we have. And the one last step I really want to go over, because this is crucial, is that whenever you send one, we're asking that you fill out this form over here. It's just name, email, and then you tick which outlets you sent a letter to. So if it's all three, you tick all three. If it's just NPR and CNN, you tick those. And then if the next day you send a letter to the editor to New York Times, you can tick that one and submit it again. None of this information will be made public. It's just so that we can see how many people are submitting them. So I was going to go over my sample, but actually I think I'm going to stop the share right here and just take a temperature check, because I feel like I've been talking a lot with my screen shared. So Alice, I see your hand.
Yeah, I had written this in the chat. The New York Times has an online version with comments. And I think like you can have like hundreds of people commenting. I'm not sure about that, but if you check into that, is that another option than just writing a letter? Because you
That's-
could get a lot of email comments to that. I'm pretty sure that works that way with the Times.
Yeah, that's very cool. And that's great to know, actually. We didn't include it in our plan for this campaign, but actually, yeah, I think why not? Go ahead. People read comments and you can.
I'm not sure if it's the Times. I know there are a lot of papers that do that. I mean, and the
Yeah.
Times has an online version, so,
Yeah.
but I could look into it and get back to you. You know.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Alice. I mean, for some papers, that's a conversation among readers. I don't know if the editorial staff ever look at it.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I
So-
think sometimes they do. They close it off if they get too many. They
well,
say,
sometimes they do.
"Close you." I don't know. Maybe that doesn't. That's fine. I don't know what it is.
No, thank you so much, though, for bringing that up, Alice. Because actually, it kind of it segues kind of well into the sample letter that I wrote that I wanted to share for this campaign. Because again, it's a little bit different than perhaps what I would write as a typical letter to the editor. But in this case, I chose to write in response to, there was this article that I saw today, actually, in the Times, which was called "The Global Nuclear Threat is Rising, in part due to the Ukraine war," a research group says. And in the entire article, they were talking about the threat of nuclear weapons and how that's been changing, I mean, all of these things that we know. But the TPNW was never once mentioned as, a possible solution to this problem. And so in this case, my message was actually to the editors, which is something that Yasmeen mentioned as well, right? Or I think actually maybe Ralph did, that often our message or our subject will be something that was in the article, something that was in the coverage. And in this case, I'm using the coverage kind of as a vehicle to target the media outlet itself, which is, I just want to make it clear that might be a little bit unusual from what you know about letters to the editor because of the goal of our campaign. But I decided, since it has to be short, it has to be focused. I first wrote out for myself, what is my single message? What's my super focused message? And for me, it was this sentence: for media coverage about the increased risk of nuclear war to be accurate and comprehensive, it's critical that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is included. So I referenced the article that I'm replying to. This is my one sort of the statement of the problem that I'm replying to. And then here I provided information about the treaty, a little bit of like the educational side in as few words as I could. Of course, I could have said much more, but just to give them some context for what this is. And then this is where I made it personal to myself. So I wanted to tie it to why am I writing? Why is this important to me? And I just wrote, since Putin invaded Ukraine, I have felt increasingly anxious about the ever-growing threat of nuclear war, but the clear pathway that this treaty provides for the elimination of nuclear weapons gives me hope. So that was my way of highlighting why this is important, not only to me, but also then hopefully sending the message that this will be important to other readers as well. And then I also mentioned here, I chose to mention the first meeting of states parties because it's coming up. And then I finished with my call to action. So that was essentially asking this media outlet, please cover the treaty whenever you talk about nuclear weapons. So I wrote, readers of the New York Times should know, as they realize the great threat posed by nuclear weapons, that there is a widely supported international effort addressing this threat. I urge you to include the treaty in discussions about nuclear weapons. So that was sort of the thinking that went into this, this letter. And that was just an example though, so yours might look completely different. It might have a different tone, you might have a different voice, but just our, all of our main message will be the same, right? Which is urging this media, whatever it is, and whatever the hook is that caused you to reach out to them, whether it was a particular article or not, this is why you need to cover the TPNW. Sorry, I think I actually talked a little bit longer than I intended, so I'm going to stop now. And
I'm sorry, I'm
Send it
going
over
twice.
to- no, it's
I got-
okay. I'm actually going to pass it back to Yasmeen, and I think she's going to take questions now. So Alice, if you have a question, maybe Yasmeen can take it.
Well, I'm just thinking what the ask is, not that they cover the treaty, but that they write that our country isn't participating and NATO countries are going to this first meeting of states parties, and why isn't the Times urging President Biden to go to the first meeting of state party as an observer? In other words, you know, like up the ante a little, you know, not just talk about it, say this about it. Because when only because you talked about the meeting of states parties. So what do we want to say about that? That our country should go too. I'm just putting that out as a thought.
Alice, if you get a chance to look at the talking points, you'll see that's there. And we're sort of having a both and approach. You know, it's fine if people just want to focus on the absence of the treaty, or if they want to focus on the first meeting, or if they want to tie the two together, you know. Hopefully they hear it enough that it sinks in.
I think it's very important that we tell the media they're not doing their job, but, you know, like put a little kicker in there, you know, when they're doing their job, this is what they should be saying. I don't know.
Awesome. I do see another, I scrolled up a bit in the chat, and Robert Randall asks, why are we writing LTEs instead of pitching a story directly to the decision makers? And I think that's a great question. There are multiple avenues that you can explore. And I think that this collaborative is exploring ways to pitch stories directly. I'm not sure if you attended the last media training that we had. However, oftentimes, especially to large media outlets like this, pitching a story requires a pretty in-depth relationship with whatever reporter you're hoping to pitch. And that kind of takes long-term grounding. What we can do for the meeting of states party is a groundswell of grassroots letters to the editor that gets the editorial board's attention in a quick way. And then, yes, you can build relationships off of that, and you can use that as a hook to start having those conversations. But in the immediate term, I don't want to put words in Ralph or other folks' mouth, but that is, I believe, part of the reason that this was selected as opposed to other avenues. All right. Other questions? If you have them, please throw them in the chat, but I am not seeing any, although Emma, folks are asking for your letter.
Yeah, we can put it up on that same page with all the resources. And actually, sorry, before I pass it back to you, Yasmeen, there was one thing I wanted to, I realized I didn't go over the last step, which is in some ways well, not the most important, but the second most important, which is, of course, you write your letter or your comment, whatever it is that you're going to send, and then you send it to the media outlet. And then is anybody able to raise their hand and let me know, remind me, what is the last thing that we do after we've sent it out to the media outlet? There's one more step that we need to do.
We send it to you.
Close, yes. But does anyone know how we send it? I think I see Jack's hand. Do you want to let us know?
On the
You want
website.
to check the box on the website of the outlets that we have reached out to.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. And I saw somebody saying that they couldn't find it. And so I'm sorry, I want to take just because, you know, I don't want this to become a hang up for anyone. And so I just want to show again from the homepage of the Nuclear Ban Treaty Collaborative. If you can't see it initially, but if you scroll downwards, this is the button where it says the yellow button, write and submit your letters to the media. And this is where all of the resources are. And I will share them in the chat. Yes, back to you, Yasmeen. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. And I did have, one thing I just do want to share before I turn the mic over to Sophia is while Emma is going to share her very wonderful letter, you do want to make it your own. And especially like important as you move forward and hopefully continue to write letters to the editor for the campaign throughout the year, like making it your own and making it personal is so important. But with that, I would love to turn it over to Sophia to talk about some current stuff coming up.
Okay, thank you, Yasmeen and Emma. Can you hear me okay? Okay, and Ralph, and everyone so much for being here. This really is a collective kind of mobilization and getting a lot of people to do a very similar thing. So thank you, thank you, thank you. The time frame, I saw somebody had a question. Time really is of the essence. Media, in the news, timeliness is really important. And so we have this tremendous kind of opportunity to make this call to cover the first meeting of states parties. Of course, the TPNW will go on beyond that, but we would love for these outlets to be reporting and on those conversations, especially given the increased threat that we hear so much about and know is happening. So knowing that there's a lot to be done and that there's a lot that many people on this call are doing, we thank you kind of for taking this step. It'll take, a little bit of time. You've already spent a little bit of time with us tonight to write these letters, to report them. So we know that this is moving forward in a good way. Beyond that, and here I go, sharing my screen. There's a few other ways that we invite you to kind of stay involved, get involved, and that we think, will further inspire to keep these media efforts going, because, in the days ahead, like we want as many letters going to these outlets. And then beyond that, we know that the more the media hears from all of us, whether that's at a local level or nationally, that does really help. So one invitation, and we welcome you, is to register for Live from Vienna. We will be hearing from a few folks who are participants and part of the Nuclear Ban Treaty Collaborative and other allied and organizations, John LaForge, Janine Yazzie, and Marian Kupker. That's going to be on Tuesday, June 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern time because of the time difference. And so maybe you come to that and maybe you feel inspired to write a second round of letters to the editor, or submit an article to a local newsletter or publication based on what you hear and learn there. So you're very welcome. You can register. I believe that Emma has dropped things in the chat, but I'm not going to try and scroll between. There's a lot of programs that you can be watching if you're not going to Vienna about the proceedings there, both the actual meeting of states parties itself, but then also like the Nuclear Ban Forum, Humanitarian Impact Conference is happening in the days leading up. All of that information, there's an abundance on ICANN's website, again, linked in the chat. If you want to be kind of on this list of folks who have signed the Nuclear Ban Treaty Collaborative Statement, both on the existential threat of nuclear weapons as well as on the TPNW, we will be closing that statement soon because it explicitly calls on our government to participate in the first meeting of states parties. So if you want your name on that list, individual or organizational, please do sign that if you haven't already. It's also a good way to stay in touch moving forward. And finally, just whenever you are moved, whenever you are organizing an action, whenever you are feeling that maybe it's sadness or overwhelm that comes from hearing about the news and the frustration that comes from the way the many conversations don't even mention disarmament when we hear them as a option, as though it's not an option that exists. And of course it does. Whenever these moments arise we encourage you to channel that perhaps into art, perhaps into organizing, or really into media. Make sure that there's someone in your local organizing group or regional who is always on kind of media duty, making sure that your local press and even the national press knows about what's going on. There are some, in addition to the first meeting of states parties, there's an opportunity to attend and encourage press to attend the press conference, being organized by nuclearban.us on June 22nd, 10:30 a.m. I believe that link is in the chat as well, with members of Congress who have actually expressed support for the TPNW. And so incorporating media efforts into all of our work. Of course, not everybody needs to do everything, but this is a very important aspect. We see this need. And so I think that does it for my portion here. Turning it, and again, just really appreciate the presenters and all of the participants today. And thank you for, it feels good to kind of partner in this effort with all of you. So I'm turning it back over to Emma.
Yes, thank you so much, Sophia. And yeah, really, actually, just what you said, I want to just say thank you to everyone who has taken their time and their energy to be here, because, you know, what we're trying to do to break the media silence on the TPNW is a really hard thing. And I think we all know that, right? It goes against the media's natural grain, because mainstream media almost always constrains itself, right, by the government's agenda. And then that, you know, frames the conversation on topics, big topics like this one. And, you know, this is not news to anyone, but in the last few months, nuclear weapons have been brought right to the forefront of, I think, everyone's consciousness. And I personally have seen more media coverage on nuclear weapons than I ever have in the rest of my life. But none of it, at least that I've seen, has mentioned the TPNW even once. You know, but nuclear war is something that threatens all of us everywhere, not just, you know, certain people in certain places. And it is irresponsible, I think, for the coverage to pretend that there is nothing that can be done when the TPNW exists, and it is so full of promise, and it provides this clear answer to this threat that we live under each day. And so mainly the thing that I just want to emphasize for everyone, but especially also for myself, is that every single letter that we are able to send out, every letter that comes from this campaign is actually so crucial. And in preparation for tonight, I actually came across an article, not a recent one. It was written several years ago, but it was written by the letters editor at the New York Times. So the person whose literal job is to read all the letters to the editor that come in and decide, you know, which ones get printed. And he'd written a piece answering people's most commonly asked questions about letters to the editor. And in it, he said that his office receives about 1,000 letters a day. And while they can only publish 15 a day at that time, I don't know if it's exactly the same now, but at that time it was about that many. But he said the staff tries to read all of them. And so the point I want to make really is that, you know, there are now 50 of us on the call. There were more earlier, and there were over 100 people registered for tonight. But I was thinking, imagine if even just every one of us who's here wrote a letter to the editor, to the New York Times. That would be, if my math skills serve me, which I hope they do, that would be like 5% of their 1,000 a day, which is actually huge. Yeah, that's right. Yes. But anyway, the point that I want to make is that, you know, when you send an email or you post a comment, it can really feel like it's going out into the void, you know, and never gets seen by anyone. And it's sort of like, why did I do that? But that's not true, right? Reading this article reminded me that's really not true, because there are real people on the other end. They're waiting for our letters. There are real people waiting for our feedback. And even if they might not know it yet, there are real people waiting for us to let them know that they really need to cover the TPNW. And I think one voice out of 1,000 can seem teeny tiny, but 50 voices, or 100 or 200, that really starts to add up. And eventually it adds up to a call that is too loud to ignore. And so, yes, the message I just want to leave you with is please, please know that every single effort you make for this campaign, for this coordinated media effort, but also beyond, is so important. So thank you just so much for taking your time and your energy, which are both so precious, to be here to learn, how we can flood these media outlets together. And let's get the TPNW out there is really all I have to say. I see that we have a few hands. It is 8 o'clock, so anybody who needs to go now, I think thank you so much for staying till now. But I wonder, for the other organizers, is it okay if we stay a few more minutes to take some questions? Okay, maybe 10 minutes.
I'd say if we have questions, that's fine. If we have speeches, maybe not.
Yes, question, that's good point. I'm going to stop the recording and